At the dinner, no one recognized the female billionaire CEO until the black waitress spoke Japanese. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. The dining room shimmered with quiet excess. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected soft amber light. Crystal stemware caught it and fractured it into 1,000 polite sparkles. Men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs, voices low, laughter measured. This was not a place for mistakes. Or so they believed. At the center table sat an older Asian woman in a deep blue dress. No logos. No diamonds loud enough to announce themselves. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her posture straight, hands folded calmly beside a half-filled glass of white wine. Around her, conversation flowed past as if she were part of the furniture, useful, decorative, invisible. A young black waitress approached the table, her uniform crisp in red and white. She moved with practiced precision, shoulders squared, eyes lowered in professional respect. She stopped beside the woman in blue and inclined her head slightly. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly, reaching for the bottle. One of the men glanced up, barely masking his impatience. "Just top it off," he muttered, already turning away. Another smirked. "Careful," he said under his breath. "That wine costs more than her monthly paycheck." A few chuckles followed. Not loud. Just enough. The waitress poured steadily. The wine rose to the perfect line, stopped cleanly. As she withdrew the bottle, someone at the far end of the table spoke in Japanese, casual, confident, assuming privacy. "She doesn't look important," the man said in his own language, eyes flicking toward the woman in blue. "Probably a translator. Or someone's aunt." The laughter came easier this time. The waitress paused. Then, without lifting her gaze, she replied in flawless, formal Japanese, calm and precise. "She is the guest of honor," she said. "And she understands everything you just said." The room didn't explode into noise. It did something far more unsettling. It went still. Forks hovered midair. A glass clinked once against crystal and stopped. Several heads turned at the same time, as if pulled by an invisible string. The men who had been smiling seconds earlier now wore the same expression, confusion sharpening into alarm. The waitress straightened slightly, still composed, hands folded at her waist. The woman in blue lifted her eyes. It was a small movement. Barely noticeable. But it changed the temperature of the room. She looked at the waitress first, not the men. There was recognition there. Respect. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze toward the speaker at the far end of the table. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't offended. It was assessing. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories sparked change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to the story. The man who had spoken in Japanese shifted in his seat. "I didn't realize," he began, switching clumsily to English. The woman raised one hand. "Just slightly." Silence obeyed. She spoke then, her voice even, unhurried. When she used Japanese, it was effortless. Native. Precise. "Please," she said. "Finish your thought." No one laughed this time. Around them, the other guests avoided eye contact. A few reached instinctively for their phones, not to record but to check messages, calendars, confirmations. Something about the way the room had shifted told them this dinner was no longer what they thought it was. The waitress remained still, eyes forward, but her breathing had slowed. For the first time that night, she was no longer just part of the service. She was part of the moment. The woman in blue set her glass down gently. The sound was soft. Final. And in that quiet dining room, beneath the polished surface of polite society, something had cracked thin at first, but spreading. No one at the table understood yet who the woman really was. But they were about to. The dinner resumed, but only on the surface. Conversation returned in fragments, carefully chosen words, forced laughter that arrived a second too late. Chairs shifted. Glasses were lifted and set down again without being emptied. Everyone at the table felt it, an invisible line had been crossed, and no one was certain who now stood on which side of it. The woman in blue remained exactly as she had been before. Her posture did not change. Her hands rested calmly near her plate. If she noticed the tension coiling around her like smoke, she gave no sign. She listened as people spoke around her, filing away tone and timing, what was said and more importantly what wasn't. To the men at the table, she was still an unresolved question. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "Who invited her?" A quiet shrug followed. "No idea. She's been here all night." They glanced at her again, trying to read meaning into her simplicity. No designer labels announcing allegiance. No jewelry competing for attention. Just presence. Unmistakable, and now unsettling. The waitress stepped back into motion, clearing plates, refilling glasses. But the way the room watched her had changed. Where she had once blended into the background, she now carried weight. Not authority but awareness. Eyes followed her path. Conversations lowered when she passed. She felt it, even without looking up. Years of service had taught her how to disappear when necessary. Tonight demanded the opposite. She kept her movements precise, professional, refusing to shrink under the sudden scrutiny. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice, when she spoke, remained level. At the head of the table, a man with silver-framed glasses cleared his throat. "So," he said, too loudly, "shall we discuss the numbers?" The woman in blue turned her attention to him. "Fully this time?" "Yes," she said. Her English was smooth, lightly accented, measured. "Let's." The man hesitated. He had expected someone else to answer. Someone louder. Someone with a title he recognized. She waited. He began outlining projections, confident at first, then faltering as she interjected, not to challenge, but to clarify. A question about timelines. Another about supply chains. Each one landed cleanly, exposing gaps he hadn't expected to explain tonight. Around the table, shoulders tightened. She wasn't asking like a guest. She was asking like an owner. The waitress paused near the edge of the table, collecting empty plates. She heard the shift before she saw it, the subtle change in cadence, the way the men adjusted their language, stripping out assumptions. Power was rearranging itself, quietly. One of the guests tried to regain control with a laugh. "You seem very informed," he said to the woman in blue. "Have you worked in the industry long?" The woman met his gaze. She didn't smile. "Long enough," she replied. That was all. Silence settled again, heavier than before. Not awkward, anticipatory. The kind that comes right before truth surfaces. At the far end of the room, a private dining manager checked his watch for the third time. Something about this table felt different now. Unstable. He made a note to alert the owner, just in case. The waitress finished clearing the last plate and stepped back. As she did, the woman in blue glanced at her just briefly. Their eyes met. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. And in that brief exchange, both of them understood the same thing: the dinner was no longer a performance. It was an examination. And some of the people at that table were about to fail. The waitress moved toward the service corridor, the soft murmur of the dining room fading behind her. For a moment, she allowed herself the smallest breath, slow, controlled, before pushing through the door and into the narrow strip of quiet reserved for staff. This was the space no one noticed. Stainless steel counters. Muted lights. The hum of refrigeration units. It was where people like her were meant to stay, useful, unseen, replaceable. She leaned her tray against the wall and steadied it with one hand. Her name was Naomi Carter. Most of the guests didn't know it. Most never asked. To them, she was a uniform and a function. Tonight had not changed that, at least, not yet. What had changed was the way the words lingered. She had learned Japanese years ago, long before the apron, long before the forced smiles and the careful neutrality. She hadn't learned it for work. She had learned it because language had once been the only thing that made her feel anchored in a world that constantly tried to misname her. It had started in a public library. A borrowed textbook. Cassette tapes that hissed and warped. She studied late at night after shifts, repeating phrases under her breath, shaping sounds that felt precise, disciplined, unforgiving of laziness. Japanese had demanded respect. It rewarded patience. Later, there had been a scholarship, small, easily overlooked. 6 months in Kyoto. Long days in lecture halls and longer nights translating menus just to afford meals. She had learned what it meant to listen before speaking. To understand hierarchy not as oppression, but as responsibility. When she returned, no one cared. Degrees didn't erase skin. Fluency didn't cancel assumptions. She took the job at the restaurant because it paid the bills and because invisibility, when mastered, could be a shield. Tonight, that shield had slipped. Naomi re-entered the dining room just as dessert was being served. The air felt denser now, like the space before a storm breaks. Conversations were clipped. Careful. She moved between tables with the same grace as before, but she could feel the glances following her, curious, cautious, unsettled. At the center table, the woman in blue was speaking again. Not loudly. She never raised her voice. But people leaned in anyway. Naomi caught fragments as she passed. Risk exposure. Long-term valuation. Governance issues you've overlooked. They weren't insults. They were worse. They were accurate. One man attempted to interrupt, smiling too hard. Perhaps we can table that discussion for another time. The woman in blue looked at him steadily. We are already at the table, she said. This is the time. Naomi set down a plate. Her hand did not shake. She realized then that the woman wasn't performing authority. She was exercising it quietly, without spectacle. That was the difference. That was why it felt dangerous. A guest near the edge of the table leaned toward Naomi as she passed. You lived in Japan? He asked, voice low, trying to sound casual. Yes, Naomi replied simply. How long? Long enough. The answer seemed to travel faster than she did. By the time she reached the service station, she could sense it clearly, the room had recalibrated. The rules people thought they understood no longer applied. Titles were being reassessed. Assumptions revised. Naomi glanced back toward the center table once more. The woman in blue met her eyes again. This time, she nodded. Not as thanks. As acknowledgement. And Naomi understood something then, with sudden clarity. The shift happened without ceremony. A new guest arrived late, escorted quietly to the table by the dining manager himself. He was Japanese, impeccably dressed, his presence carrying a gravity that didn't need introduction. When he sat, several of the men straightened instinctively, offering polite smiles that bordered on relief. This, they thought, was someone they understood. He greeted the table in Japanese, bowing slightly. The men responded with nods, pleased to return to familiar ground. The language flowed quickly, now too quickly, they assumed, for anyone outside their circle to follow. This partnership still has leverage, the man said in Japanese, his tone low. But only if we control the narrative. She doesn't seem like a decision maker. A pause. Naomi stood a few steps away, refilling water glasses. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Before anyone else could respond, she spoke clear, respectful, precise. "Excuse me," she said in Japanese. "She is not only the decision maker. She is the final authority." The sentence landed like a dropped plate. The Japanese guest turned toward her slowly, surprise flashing across his face before settling into something closer to recognition. He studied her for a moment, then followed her gaze to the woman in blue. He stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he bowed deeply this time, unmistakably to the woman at the center of the table. "My apologies," he said, switching to English. "I should have known." Every conversation around them died instantly. The woman in blue inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the gesture. "No apology necessary," she replied. "Assumptions are efficient. They're just often wrong." One of the men laughed nervously. "I think we're all learning something tonight." "Yes," she said. "We are." Naomi felt the shift ripple outward. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was recalculation. The Japanese guest returned to his seat, visibly more careful now. "We were discussing terms," he said, choosing his words with new precision. "Specifically, governance." "Good," the woman replied. "Then let's be honest about them." She turned slightly, addressing the entire table. "Several of you entered this dinner believing you were here to persuade me. You are not." She let the silence stretch. "You are here because I am deciding whether you remain relevant." No one interrupted. Naomi watched faces tighten, smiles fade, masks slip just enough to reveal fear beneath polish. She had seen this before, though never from this angle. Power, when exposed, always demanded honesty. Not everyone survived it. The woman in blue reached for her glass, took a small sip, then continued. "Language reveals more than intent. It reveals habit. Tonight, you spoke freely because you believed no one was listening." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi. "You were mistaken." The Japanese guest nodded slowly. "Then we should proceed with clarity." "Yes," she said. "We should." Naomi stepped back, heart steady, mind clear. She understood now what her words had done. They had not embarrassed anyone. They had corrected the hierarchy. Language had been the weapon, but restraint was the force behind it. Around the table, phones buzzed softly. Messages arrived. Assistants were alerted. Somewhere beyond the dining room, consequences were already assembling. Naomi returned to her station, her role unchanged on paper. But she knew better. Tonight had proven something she had always suspected. Being unseen was never the same as being powerless. And the woman in blue had just made that lesson unavoidable. The dinner had crossed a point of no return. What followed was not confrontation, but exposure. Folders appeared on the table, sleek leather, embossed initials catching the light. A man 2 seats down slid one toward the woman in blue with cautious deference, as if offering evidence rather than information. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked around the table, letting her gaze settle on each face in turn. Some met her eyes briefly, then looked away. Others held on too long, hoping confidence alone could shield them. "You invited me here for alignment," she said calmly. "But alignment requires honesty. And honesty requires leverage." She nodded once. Only then did Naomi step forward, not as a waitress, but as a witness, placing a tablet gently beside the unopened folder. The screen lit up automatically. Market data. Ownership structures. Minority stakes that weren't so minor after all. The room leaned in despite itself. One man swallowed. That information isn't public. No, the woman replied. It's precise. She tapped the edge of the tablet once, not looking at it. I acquired controlling interest in 3 of your suppliers 18 months ago. Quietly. Another 2, last quarter. A chair shifted. Someone inhaled sharply. That's not possible, another man said. We would have been notified. She smiled, not warmly, not cruelly. Simply acknowledging the statement. You were, she said. You just didn't recognize the name. She finally opened the folder. Inside were documents, clean, orderly, undeniable. Logos aligned with signatures. Timelines mapped with unnerving clarity. What they had believed was a negotiation now revealed itself as an audit. The Japanese guest exhaled slowly. You structured this dinner, he said. Yes, she replied. I structured the opportunity. She closed the folder again. What happens next depends on how well you listen. Silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. Naomi stood still at her side, hands folded, eyes forward. She felt it the moment the room accepted a new truth. Not loudly. Not gracefully. But fully. One of the men cleared his throat. And if we don't agree? The woman in blue tilted her head slightly, as if considering a question she'd already answered long ago. Then this ends tonight, she said. Cleanly. Quietly. And permanently. No threat. No raised voice. Just fact. Phones vibrated again, this time more urgently. Messages stacked. Alerts flashed. Somewhere, far from this table, people were already reacting to moves they didn't yet understand. The woman reached for her glass, lifted it just an inch, then set it back down untouched. I don't need consensus, she continued. I need competence. Her eyes moved, finally resting on Naomi. And I need people who hear what others dismiss. The implication settled slowly, then all at once. Naomi felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something sharper. Recognition had become invitation. Around the table, deals unraveled in real time, not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with the quiet efficiency of power correcting a miscalculation. The dinner was no longer about food. It was about who had mistaken proximity for control. And who had just learned the cost of that mistake. The reveal did not come with an announcement. It arrived the way real power always did, through confirmation. The dining manager returned quietly, posture stiff, whispering into the ear of a man who had been checking his phone too often. The color drained from his face. He nodded once, then stood, smoothing his jacket as if that could restore balance. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice tight, there has been a clarification. No one laughed. The woman seated with us tonight, he continued, gesturing carefully toward the center of the table, is not a guest of this dinner. The pause stretched. She is its principal sponsor. The words moved through the room like a current. Not shock recognition. A truth snapping into place, rearranging everything that came before it. The woman in blue did not react. She had already moved on. I don't attend dinners for introductions, she said evenly. I attend them for evaluation. She placed one hand flat on the table. You have evaluated me all evening. Now it's my turn. A man near the far end leaned forward, desperate to recover ground. With respect, he said, we didn't realize who you were. She looked at him, then really looked. That, she replied, was the point. Naomi felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. This wasn't a negotiation collapsing. It was a hierarchy being corrected. The woman had never needed recognition to exercise authority. She had simply allowed others to expose themselves first. The Japanese guest bowed his head slightly. We underestimated you, he said. Yes, she agreed. And you underestimated the room. She glanced briefly toward Naomi, then back to the table. You spoke freely because you believed power wore a uniform you could identify. Titles, accents, appearances. Her voice remained calm, but every word landed clean. You were wrong. Phones buzzed again. Louder this time. One man read an email and went still. Another muttered, "This can't be happening," under his breath. "It is," she said. "And it has been for some time." She reached into her clutch and placed a single business card on the table. No embellishment. Just a name and a company logo few people ever saw up close. Silence followed. One of the men pushed his chair back slightly. "You're the majority stakeholder," he said, disbelief edging his voice. She nodded once. "In this deal," she added. "And several others you haven't noticed yet." Naomi realized then that the woman had not come to dinner to prove anything. She had come to observe behavior under false assumptions and decide what to do with the information. The woman in blue stood slowly. Not to leave. Just enough to command the room. "This partnership will proceed," she said, "but not as proposed. Terms will be revised. Leadership restructured. And some of you will not be included." No anger. No satisfaction. Just conclusion. She turned to Naomi. "Walk with me," she said quietly. Naomi obeyed, stepping out from the shadow she had learned to inhabit. As they moved away from the table, the remaining guests sat frozen, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner they no longer controlled. Behind them, deals unraveled. Ahead of them, something else began. And for the first time that night, Naomi understood exactly who the woman in blue had always been and why no one else had. The consequences did not announce themselves. They moved quietly, the way real decisions always did. As the woman in blue and Naomi stepped away from the table, the room remained suspended in a fragile stillness. No one followed them. No one spoke. The sound of cutlery against porcelain felt suddenly inappropriate, almost obscene. At the edge of the dining room, the woman paused. She didn't look back. "Send the notices," she said calmly. Naomi nodded. She didn't ask to whom. She didn't need to. Within minutes, phones around the table began to vibrate again, this time with urgency that could not be disguised. Screens lit up beneath the tablecloths. Faces tightened as messages were read, reread, then silently passed along. One man stood abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, already stepping away to take the call. Another followed. Then another. The illusion of composure fractured. Whispers spread in uneven waves. "She pulled out." "No, she froze it." "All of it." "Yes." Effective immediately. The Japanese guest remained seated, hands folded, eyes lowered. He alone seemed to understand what was happening. This wasn't retaliation. It was removal. At the center of the table, the folders that had once promised leverage now felt like evidence left behind at a closed trial. No one reached for them anymore. Near the entrance, Naomi stopped beside the woman in blue. "They're unraveling," Naomi said quietly. "Yes," the woman replied. "They were already unstable. Tonight simply revealed it." A man approached hesitantly, tie loosened, voice thin. "We can adjust terms," he said. "Revisit assumptions." The woman regarded him without expression. "Assumptions were your first mistake," she said. "Adjustment won't correct that." She turned away before he could respond. Across the room, a senior partner slammed his phone down onto the table, breath shallow. "The board's pulling out," he whispered to no one in particular. "They're saying exposure risk." Another voice answered him, sharp with disbelief. "Because of one dinner." "No," someone else said quietly. "Because of who was at it." The woman in blue walked toward the exit with unhurried precision. Naomi matched her pace. Behind them, years of confidence collapsed under the weight of new information. Deals that had taken months to build disintegrated in minutes, not out of spite, but out of necessity. At the door, the woman stopped once more. "Leave the rest to them," she said. "They'll do enough damage on their own." Outside, the night air was cool and clean. The city moved on, unaware that several futures had just been rewritten over dessert. Naomi took a slow breath. Inside, the dinner continued without them, emptier, quieter, stripped of its illusions. Justice, it turned out, didn't need to raise its voice. It only needed to leave. They didn't go far. Just beyond the dining room, past the glass doors and the muted glow of the restaurant, there was a quiet corridor lined with dark wood and framed photographs of people who once believed they mattered. The woman in blue stopped there, the noise of the dinner dissolving behind them. "For a moment," she said, "this is enough distance." Naomi nodded, hands clasped in front of her. Up close, the woman's presence felt different, lighter, almost. Not diminished. Simply unburdened. "You handled yourself well tonight," the woman continued. "Not just with language. With restraint." Naomi hesitated. "I didn't plan to speak." "That's usually when the truth comes out," the woman replied. They stood in silence for a beat. Not awkward. Measured. "You learned Japanese for reasons that had nothing to do with serving tables," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Naomi's shoulders eased slightly. "Yes. You stayed invisible because the world made it efficient," she added. "Not because you lacked ambition." Naomi met her gaze for the first time without instinctively lowering her eyes. "Invisibility keeps you safe," she said. "Until it doesn't." A faint smile touched the woman's lips. "Exactly." She reached into her clutch again, but this time she didn't pull out a card. She pulled out her phone, tapped once, then held the screen out. An email draft. No subject line yet. Just a single sentence in the body. "I'd like you to consider something more permanent." Naomi stared at it, pulse steady but sharp. "I don't have the resume you're expecting," she said quietly. The woman shook her head. "I'm not expecting a resume. I'm inviting perspective." She lowered the phone. "I need people who hear what's said when others assume silence. People who understand power without needing to perform it." Naomi took a slow breath. The corridor felt smaller now, not confining, but focused. "What would that mean?" she asked. "It would mean leaving this job," the woman said simply. "Training. Access. A seat in rooms where decisions are made before they're announced." Naomi didn't answer right away. The woman waited. Finally, Naomi spoke. "I won't be anyone's symbol." The woman's expression sharpened, not with offense, but approval. "Good," she said. "I don't collect symbols. I build structures." She extended her hand. Naomi took it. The gesture was brief. Firm. Equal. Behind them, inside the dining room, the consequences continued to spread unchecked, irreversible. Ahead of them, something quieter took shape. Not revenge. Not reward. Opportunity earned, and finally seen. The dining room never fully recovered. Long after the woman in blue and Naomi had left, the table remained fractured, empty chairs, untouched glasses, conversations that never found their rhythm again. The men who stayed spoke in half sentences, eyes darting to doors that no longer mattered. By morning, the story had already changed shape. Emails arrived before sunrise. Meetings were postponed, then cancelled. Boards convened without ceremony. Words like restructuring, strategic realignment, and unforeseen exposure appeared in subject lines meant to soften impact. They failed. What had collapsed wasn't just a deal. It was an illusion. The men who once believed themselves gatekeepers discovered, quietly and all at once, that they had never held the keys. Influence they thought was permanent proved conditional. Names that once commanded rooms were suddenly missing from agendas. And no one could say exactly when it happened, only that it had. Across the city, Naomi woke to a different silence. Not the hollow kind she was used to after late shifts, but something steadier. Intentional. Her uniform hung untouched by the door. On the table lay her phone, the screen lit with a single message waiting to be opened. No urgency. No pressure. Just possibility. She thought of the dinner, the way language had shifted the room, the way restraint had carried more weight than anger ever could. She understood now what she had always felt but never named: dignity wasn't granted. It was recognized, sometimes late, sometimes at a cost. Elsewhere, the woman in blue stood at the window of her hotel suite, city lights reflecting faintly in the glass. The night had gone exactly as she expected. People, given space to reveal themselves, almost always did. She didn't think of it as revenge. It was calibration. She had seen enough rooms to know this one wasn't unique. Power often mistook familiarity for entitlement. And entitlement, left unchallenged, always rotted. That was why she moved quietly. Why she listened longer than others spoke. Why she paid attention to who was ignored and who noticed. By the end of the week, headlines would surface. Analysts would speculate. Names would be reassessed. But the truest lesson of the night wouldn't make the news. It would live in smaller places. In the way Naomi walked into her next room without lowering her eyes. In the way the woman in blue continued to build without asking permission. In the memory of a table that learned too late that uniforms lie, accents mislead, and silence often listens best. They had judged by appearances. They had paid with consequence. And neither woman needed to look back to know the lesson had landed.